So we are continuing with Ulladu Narpadu or Saddarshanam. We finished up to verse number 26, which concluded what was known as the chapter on discrimination of what is reality and what is not. Now the next three verses form a short but most important chapter called Inquiry. This chapter is the condensation of what is the practice of self-inquiry. It has only three verses, and these three verses point to what is self-inquiry and what is not self-inquiry. Before we go into the verses, one thing that is important to clarify is that the word inquiry is normally used to imply some kind of a research or investigation into phenomena. So this can include employing logic, reasoning, and observation and so on in order to ascertain the truth of phenomena. Such inquiry is applicable in scientific field, for instance, and in general in any objective phenomena. But what is implied by inquiry here, what Sri Ramana Maharshi points to as inquiry, is an inquiry of a totally different kind, which talks about the inquiry into the nature of the one inquiring himself. That is to say, inquiring into the subject and not into the object, which is what is observed as phenomena. And therefore, this inquiry is that which takes us inward without the aid of any external tools such as memory and reasoning and logic, but simply taking the mind inward and finding the truth of the source of our very being. That is inquiry in this context, or vichara in Sanskrit. With that, we will enter the verses. There are three verses, as we said. Verse number 27, I'll first chant the verse. நான் உதியாது உள்ள நிலை நாம் அதுவாய் உள்ள நிலை நான் உதிக்கும் தானம் அதை நாடாமல் நான் உதியா தன்னிழப்பை சார்வதெவன் சாராமல் தானதுவாம் தன்னிலையில் நிற்பதெவன் சாற்று. So the first thing that has been made very clear through the entire chapter on discrimination is that the ego is the veil that hides our true nature as what we are. And therefore, this verse summarizes the entire teaching in the first line by saying that the state when the ego does not rise is the supreme state, because it is the loss of ego or the removal of this veil of ego that is alone necessary for us to realize our true being. And this ego is nothing but this separative idea that I am this body or I am this collection of thoughts which we call the mind. So he points out here that the state where the I does not rise as the body or as the mind, but simply remains without any identification is that state. And this state is that which cannot be captured in words beyond that. So one of the things we see very clearly is that in all our waking, dream, and deep sleep, there is the presence of the ego which veils our true nature. So in waking and dream, it's very clear that there is the ego which identifies itself as I with a particular body and collection of thoughts, and therefore identification with different constructs. And through that, it has desires and fears, likes and dislikes, and so on. And even in deep sleep, even though the I is not active, it is present as a seed that contains the essence of the egoic tendencies which wakes up upon the body waking up. So in all the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, the ego is present, and therefore we find that there is misery, suffering, fear, anger, and all the other symptoms of the ego, which is veiling the true nature of peace and happiness. So what Ramana Maharshi points to is that when this ego does not rise, then we remain as that, and that is our essential nature. And that cannot be described in words beyond this. And this is why we even see the highest teaching was imparted by Dakshinamurti in silence and not through words, because the positive description of the state is not possible through the verbal medium, except to say that it is a state where the ego does not rise. So then the question comes, what is the adequate means for removing this veil of the ego? That is being answered in the same verse by saying that by seeking the source from where the I rises. Without doing that, he asks us a question: how can one effectively remove the ego without looking at the source from where the ego rises? It is very reasonable to say that if you want to remove something, we need to find out where it comes from. Instead of trying to learn more knowledge, acquire more information, and assert more statements about this ego, to simply find out where this ego rises from is the direct path. And that's what Sri Ramana Maharshi points out by saying, without finding out where the I rises, how can one effectively remove the ego? And when one inquires where the ego rises, then one finds that the nature of our pure consciousness, which is the source of the ego, alone remains free of all thoughts. And that state is what is called as the natural state, or Sahaja Sthiti in Sanskrit. And this is also called as loss of the individual self, or also known as deathless death, because the death of the false ego results in the deathless state of pure awareness, which is our essential nature. And one more thing that's pointed out in this verse is that it is not something that can be done through making the mind subside temporarily. There are many practices which take the mind into a samadhi state, or even in the case of deep sleep, the same thing happens. The mind goes into some kind of a total quietness, and swoon, the same thing. But none of these states result in true realization, because when one wakes up from deep sleep, or comes out of swoon, or comes out of any kind of yogic samadhi, it still comes back into the egoic consciousness. And therefore, what is pointed out here is not going into some kind of temporary subsidence of the ego only for it to come back, but for the total annihilation through the inquiry of where is the I or the ego coming from. The next verse makes it even more clear. Verse 28. I'll chant the verse again. எழும்பும் அகந்தை எழுமிடத்தை நீரில் விழுந்த பொருள் காண வேண்டி முழுகுதல் போல் கூர்ந்த மதியால் பேச்சு மூச்சடக்கி கொண்டுள்ளே ஆழ்ந்தறிய வேண்டும் அறி. Here he says, as if someone lost something inside water, how one dives within the water by holding the breath and the tongue and everything, all the faculties, with one pointed focus to go to the floor. It can be, a particular example is given for pearl divers, how they go into the ocean, to the ocean floor itself, holding the breath, and with one pointed focus get the pearl and come out. So Ramana Maharishi says that with a similar one pointed focus, one has to seek within where this I is rising from, and by diving deep within one's own being and seeking the source of the I, one can find out one's own essential nature. That's the meaning of this verse. And here, why it is said inward is because it is not necessarily to say that the nature of our being is only within the body and there is no division in that sense. It is just to point out that the normal state of the mind is being externalized through sense objects by going outwardly. So to say within is to simply take the mind away from the distraction of all sense objects and go into the very question of where is the I or where is the sense of ego rising from. And in that question, there is actually no inside or outside, because uh, the moment that question is asked, the division of inside and outside even goes away, because that is itself a construct only as long as thought operates. So if you ask the question, where is this I or the ego rising from? That is what is implied by going inward, and that is what is implied by going to the heart. Heart is again not necessarily the physical organ, but simply saying that it is the very essence of our being and another name for our very nature. And another thing that's pointed out here is that one has to abandon speech and breath and go like a pearl diver. Now, this does not necessarily imply learning any pranayama technique or trying to hold breath for a long time and all of that. What is simply implied is that when one has complete one pointed focus on this one quest, one inquiry of where the I is coming from, then it naturally stops all movement of thought, and therefore also breath is naturally suspended. One can even observe this in very concentrated activities, that breath slows down on its own. So we don't have to make any overt attempt to stop breath, but all is pointed out is that just as one with one pointed focus uh, goes about any given task, if one has to achieve success in this particular task, which is the most important of all in terms of realizing our own essential nature, one has to go within with that one pointedness, and that's what is implied by that. Having said that, a simple practice such as watching one's breath can be of great use, and even Ramana Maharshi has recommended it for something to start with, by not taking any particular type of breathing but simply watching the inflow and the outflow of breath. That itself is a great aid, because watching the ingoing outgoing breath quietens the mind naturally, and then one can go within and ask where this I is rising from. The other important point to be brought out here is that the one pointedness is directly tied to dispassion, or what is known in Sanskrit as vairagya. The reason for that is, as long as one has passion for worldly objects of any kind, that acts as an obstacle in this quest of being one pointed in the inner inquiry. Therefore, to have dispassion by realizing that all the outer objects are simply projections of thought, and therefore they have no actual substantial reality, because they come and go. Every outer phenomena, whether it is a physical object or an intellectual idea or an experience, are all, number one, impermanent, they come and go, and number two, they have no inherent value, because they are only what thought projects them to be, and that is why the same phenomena is loved by one and hated by another, and so on. So they have no inherent value, they are impermanent, and they go away. By realizing this very clearly through discrimination, and by having a natural dispassion toward all external phenomena and experiences, one can naturally have this one pointedness of finding what is my essential nature, because the only thing that remains fixed is the sense of I. And that I is seen to be the root of all trouble. Various things come and go, the body changes, the relations change, the job changes, family changes, even national identities change, but the one thing that remains fixed is the I, and that I, no matter what change is made outwardly, still causes suffering by the duality of likes and dislikes, wants and fears, and so on. So, to find out the very source of where this I comes from, rather than being lost in all these external phenomena, is the essence of inquiry. And that requires one pointedness and therefore dispassion, which are really one and the same thing. And we also find that the more internalized we become, the more a natural force, or what we can call as grace, rises from within and takes us inward. And therefore, what is necessary is to develop that maturity for us to be truly dedicated to this pursuit, to realize that this is the most important and the only essential pursuit that is necessary. Everything else comes and goes. And therefore, to have the dedication and devotion to this pursuit results in a natural one-pointedness, and by that grace rises up, and one can then surrender to this grace as it rises up. And the reason the word devotion is important is because it is not something that is a very dry intellectual topic, but it is actually finding out the very source of my own being. What makes the body breathe? What makes the senses function? What makes thoughts happen? What is that one force that is the very root of my being and also the very root of all that I see as the universe? Because it's very clearly seen that there is some energy that is making everything operate, which we call as God. So to find out God is not to find out some external entity, but to find out the very source of my own existence. So if I connect to God as the source of my existence, and therefore to realize that to question where I come from is to actually find out God Himself, then that is the highest form of devotion, which is the highest form of inquiry as well. And therefore, devotion is highly encouraged, because even if the devotion starts as one of external devotion, if we through inquiry and surrender realize that the same God who is responsible for the world is responsible for me too, and therefore I internalize my quest, then the devotion results in inquiry becoming one-pointed. And another example given here is how a dog, for example, when it's lost away from his master, traces the way back by the scent of the master, they say. Similarly, the scent of God in us is our egoic sense, because actually we say that I exist, and that very existence is our is the way consciousness functions in us. And therefore, if I question where this I comes from and trace the scent of this egoic I consciousness back to its source, then that in turn is God Himself, the pure consciousness, free of any attributes. The last verse in this chapter, I'll chant this, 29th. நான் என்று வாயால் நவிலாதுள் ஆழ்மனத்தால் நான் என்றெங்குந்துமென நாடுதலே ஞான நெறி ஆமன்றி அன்றிது நான் ஆமதுவென்று உன்றல் துணை ஆமது விசாரம் ஆமா. Here, Sri Ramana Maharshi points out that other than this inquiry, any inquiry done through the help of mind is truly not inquiry. Because one thing we see is that the verse in fact literally says that to not say I, but to question where the I rises from is inquiry. But to simply say I am not this, I am that, it can be an aid, but can it be true inquiry? That's the question he asks. Because we see that in Vedanta, or in traditional Vedantic method, there is a lot of emphasis given on the threefold process of what is called as Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, which is to listen and then contemplate and then abide in that. And the listening is for a truth such as Tattvam Asi, that is to say, thou art that, or I am Brahman, and then to contemplate on that and then to abide in that. Such process can be of help because it clears many intellectual confusion one might have. But what Sri Ramana points out here is that that in itself cannot be the direct path, because it still takes the I to be the some kind of an entity that exists, and then another notion called Brahman, and it says I am Brahman, and one doesn't know what Brahman is except as a thought, except as knowledge gained from texts. And the I whose source if we don't trace, then we take it to be the ego, which is the body, and therefore it does not really result in the loss of the ego, but in only in effect adding one more concept. So it can be of some aid to clear certain doubts one might have, but it is not the direct path, is what he points out. And the direct path then, of course, again he repeats in this verse, is to inquire where the I comes from. Because if we do not inquire where this I is coming from, and instead simply say I am that, then we are actually giving more food to the mind by giving one more thought for it to chew onto, rather than questioning where the I is rising from and thereby putting into all thoughts. So that's why it is again repeated that to say I am that has already a duality of I and that, and in that duality there is thought, and therefore thought sustains itself and attains longevity through chewing on this. And this is why we see so many who are well versed in Vedanta can go on and give long lectures, but it's not necessarily changing the way they are functioning, because the I is still existing very much alive and just taking on one more concept called Brahman or whatever it is. And the fundamental symptoms in which the I exhibits itself through desire, anger, pleasure seeking, pain, all of that do not go away. And therefore, there is no sense of peace and bliss except as a concept. So that's why Sri Ramana again points out that instead of ascertaining I am that, simply find out where the I is coming from. And by inquiring where the I is coming from, you can find out the very source of your own being, which is the source of the universe, which is God Himself, who pulsates as pure awareness within and without in all forms. And that's why the question, who am I and where I is coming from, are both the same question, because who am I simply asks the question as to what is my real truth, and where am I is simply a question that asks what is the source of the sense I that is appearing as me. And both of them will take us to the same point where we realize that this I that appears as our identity is simply something that is inherently our very nature, that has taken on a limitation through body and mind thoughts. And therefore, to seek the source of this consciousness that we call as I, as the ego, by freeing it of all the other limitations that it has taken on, but just asking where is this I coming from, is the direct path of self-inquiry, and it results in realizing our true nature, which is called as the natural state or Sahaja Sthiti. Thank you.